The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime. Hello and welcome to The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, the Art Basel fair has just opened in Switzerland. So, are collectors back and are they buying? As well as talking to Jane Morris, an editor-at-large at the Art newspaper, about Art Basel, I talked to the classicist Mary Beard about her new book 12 Caesars, looking at representations of power across 2,000 years of art history. And in this episode's Work of the Week, we focus on Christo and Jeanne-Claude's Arc de Triomphe wrapped, the last ever wrapping project by the late duo. I talked to Vladimir Yavachev, Christo's nephew, who's overseen the final stages of the project in Paris. Before all that, our sister podcast A Brush With is back for a new series of 4 episodes with in-depth artist interviews. The latest episode is A Brush With Tacita Dean. So subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to hear that and to explore the archive of more than 25 conversations. Now, after being cancelled last year and postponed earlier this year, the Art Basel Fair finally opened in Basel this week. Galleries have been nervous about a dearth of collectors after the US issued a do not travel advisory for Switzerland at the end of August, prompting Art Basel to send a letter of reassurance and concessions to its exhibitors, pledging to foot the bill for any hotel quarantine and to create a solidarity relief fund apportioned out to any galleries disappointed with their sales at the fair. So, what's it like in Basel now the fair's open? Jane Morris, an editor-at-large for the Art newspaper, has been at the fair all week, and I spoke to her about her impressions. Jane, there were a lot of jitters ahead of the fair because of this advice from the US government about travelling to Switzerland. Were the jitters founded or unfounded?
So there were obviously a lot of jitters before the fair started. Because of the US travel advisory, people didn't expect the Americans to come, by and large. And they didn't really expect many visitors from Asia. Obviously, America is still the largest section of the art market. It's probably, 45-50% of the market. And Asia, as we know, is growing rapidly. Now, it has turned out that it was true. There are very few Americans here. There are some. Opinions vary on who and why, but there are some. And I'm sure there will be the odd Asian collector here, but in general, there are very, very few Americans here and very, very few Asians. Nevertheless, it does look like the European collectors have turned out in force. It inevitably feels a lot quieter. 11 a.m. on the first day, I stood outside the Messerplatz, then I went into the central area. Well, in fact, it was a little bit earlier because they allowed people to flow into the central area, and it felt quiet. Within an hour or two, again, it felt quieter, but there were a lot of conversations happening on both floors. And several dealers said to me that although they were nervous about those first couple of hours, actually things started to improve very quickly. And I think it would be fair to say that the European collectors have enjoyed, certainly the ones I've spoken to, have enjoyed the fact that it's nothing like as crowded. You know, the Americans often rush in and start making deals really quickly. I mean, these are gross simplifications, but this is what tends to happen. The Europeans have had longer, they've had more conversations, it's been slower, but there's no doubt that a lot of sales have happened.
Can you tell me about some of those sales? Have the galleries been giving you details of about what they've sold?
Yes, I mean, there's actually quite long lists of reported sales coming out now. There's been quite a lot of reporting about this Basquiat that's on Van de Vega. As far as I'm aware, that's not yet sold. It's priced at reportedly 40 million, and it's a really good one. It's a 1983. It's called Hardware Store. It's like 2 coloured boards, yellow and blue, and the words estimated value written on it. Obviously, it's been very widely photographed. There's been a lot of talk about it. As far as we know, not yet sold, but lots of other things in the million-plus mark have gone. A couple of the highlights was a beautiful Philip Guston on Hauser and Wirth, the poet from 1975. That sold for $6.5 million. A large Robert Rauschenberg that's being shown in Art Unlimited by Tadeusz Ropak called Rolling Salvage. That has sold for $4.5 million. And as I say, there's been several of those large, $3, $4, $5 million sales reported. Obviously, the vast majority of sales are probably more in the kind of, low end $40,000 up to $500,000, but there's been lots and lots of them reported. I should say this sort of reporting is always quite skewed though. There are 250 galleries here. Everybody goes and talks to the big ones first. So everybody talks to Hauser and White Cube, Pace, Werner, and then they probably go and talk to the galleries with artists that they like. So inevitably we skew our reporting. It is quite probable that there are smaller and mid-level galleries who haven't yet sold anything. Having said that, the galleries I spoke to generally seemed very, very happy. I spoke to Alison Jacques and she'd done very well. She specialises in women artists, sometimes more historic, also some younger ones. She'd done very well. Mendes Wood, which has got a very large selection, often of Brazilian artists, amongst others, they've done very well. So I mean, generally, people seem to have done well.
You've been to several Basel fairs before. One of the things that's always said about Basel is that the galleries wait to sell their best fair works of the year at Basel. It's the fair that everybody loves the most. It's the one that they save their best works for. Do you think that's the case this time? Or because of the sort of skewed nature of the market at the moment, it feels different?
Well, I always slightly wonder what people mean when they say the best works. So let's perhaps clarify. I would say that generally people bring the best work by the artists they have chosen to show. But most galleries, the big ones represent, up to, there could be as many as 80 artists. And at one end, they'll have kind of whoever they think is a hot young, thing. And at the other end, we could be talking about an artist estate of an artist who is absolutely firmly established in the canon. So yes, I think generally people don't bring B and C list works by the artists they represent, but there's a big choice about which artists to bring.
I mean, obviously, there's one of the things I wondered was whether if you've got a reduced collector base at the fair, would that necessarily mean that people were more conservative in what they did bring because then they would be more guaranteed to sell?
Yes, absolutely. I think for me, Art Unlimited was the first, let's say, not the only one, but was the bellwether of that because it opens first. It opens on the Monday evening before the main fair opens the following day. Art Unlimited, I'm sure most of the listeners know, but just in case you don't, it's almost like a warehouse space. And it's used for very large-scale works. So it could be very big sculpture, very large paintings. It often has a lot of video. And it's a bit more like going to a biennale or something. Art Basel says it's curated, but it's not curated in the way a biennale is curated. So there aren't themes running through it. It does depend what the dealers have decided to bring. But it can vary from some very, very exciting sort of out there installations. You could even have very long video. It just gives a flavour of what people feel, is likely to sell. And I think the thing that was very noticeable, some years it's very risk-taking. Some years it is full of very large installations that might have a lot of digital elements incorporated. You could have big videos, long videos, difficult videos, and people are really showing them to kind of show off their programme. This time, I thought it actually looks really good because it has got a surprisingly large amount of minimal or older artists, established masters who look very good in this kind of space. So there is a huge Dan Flavin, pink Dan Flavin from 1974. In the middle, there's a John Chamberlain. It's not one of the crushed cars. It's like this huge sort of tinfoil structure. And it's, it looks absolutely great in there. There's a pink sort of set of pink minimal canvases by Ettore Spallette. But I just kept thinking, gosh, there's a lot of classic Americans here. There's a lot of mid-century Italians here. There's a really fantastic installation of works by Sherry Levine. She rephotographs other artists, and this one is called After Russell Lee. Now, it's actually it's a more recent work, but, when I think of Sherry Levine, I think of the 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, exactly.
So that runs throughout Unlimited. A few people have been a little bit more, experimental. So there's a Lawrence Abu Hamdan sound installation installed. But by and large, I'm not saying it looks like deer. That would be aggrandizing Art Unlimited, but it definitely has an ode to deer, if you know what I mean.
I mean, it's really curious, isn't it? Because I mean, of course, the fact that this is happening is quite a landmark moment, because we've, the major fairs we've also had the Armory, had the Armory in New York, for instance, but so many major fair postponements. It's been the sort of crisis area of the market, really. Does it feel to you like there's a sort of general sense in which this is getting back to normal, or does it feel more like there's still the sort of jitteriness, there's still the sense that we're not sure what's coming next? Are people like, this is the first step towards normality?
I would say this is the first step towards normality, actually. I think what I was struck by was people were very, very happy to be back in the fair. There was a bit of a sense, I think a number of people have said it, of a back-to-school reunion. And because there wasn't so many of us there, it was much easier to see people your friends It was also easier to talk to people you didn't know. So I found that I could go up and talk to galleries that I didn't know at all, and people were very friendly, very happy to speak. And then you'd bump into somebody you haven't seen for the best part of 2 years. So I think people were very happy to be back together again. I think people were very happy to see art in the real again. A number of curators, there were a lot of curators here. Again, people talked about the fact that a lot of the big American curators weren't here and they missed them. Obviously a lot of the big patrons groups, again, the same. But the curators who were here said just how nice it was to see art again, even though these are the people who don't tend to love art fairs. So no, I mean, I think people were definitely happy to be back. Of course, people have used digital a lot, but I do think there's a question about how much people are largely using digital as marketing and communications rather than really a sales tool. I know there's this question about young Asian buyers. There's also a lot of discussion about, I think, speculation over there, where the art is being used much more like an investment buy. But I would say that certainly the European collectors and curators I talked to were happy to be back at a fair, actually. I don't think they love endlessly scrolling through OVRs. And as a side point, I would also note that actually only 40% roughly of the galleries here have actually done the Art Basel OVR this time.
Ah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because we were told, in a way, the headlines were all about how OVRs are kind of now a central part of that package and eventually would sort of have a parity with the sort of in-person sales. But you think that that's not certain?
I think that, this is such a difficult one because, if you sort of raise questions about digital, everyone immediately thinks you're a dinosaur. And I think that's not true. I think, obviously, people are happy to buy and sell things online. But I think we should also be clear, very few art sales are true digital sales, by which I mean you saw it online, you paid for it online, you shipped it and everything online, and you didn't literally see the thing until it landed on your door, because the gallery always wants to intervene in that process. So most of the sales processes are encouraging you to then speak to a gallery director, who then you sit with on Zoom, no doubt, and then they show you the work. Yeah, arguably it's still sort of digital, but I don't think it's digital in the way the retail world recognises a true digital sale. I also think, as is often discussed, it's much easier if you know the artist's work really well. And I think if you're very familiar with an artist's work, I don't think you'd have any problem buying something online. And as I say, if you're a new buyer who's essentially buying in a more speculative way, you want to buy a hot artist, you want to flip it round, get it into auction, 6-8 months later, then I can also see that's fine because you don't really care what the work looks like because you're not actually intending to keep it. I'm not saying that there will not be large amounts of digital sales. I'm just saying I think the jury is a bit out. I think art is such an expensive object. Even cheap art is really expensive. And the number of people who can buy it are really very few. And I do wonder how many people actually collect because they really like coming to fairs and like going to galleries and like meeting the artists and like hanging out with the dealers. I mean, a lot of them say that that's what they like. Now, again, I'm not speaking to 25-year-olds, so no, I'm not ruling it out. But I do think the fact that a substantial majority of the galleries at Art Basel didn't choose to use the Art Basel OVR says something. Not quite sure what yet. I haven't spoken to enough people.
No, it's a really interesting development. I wondered if, like, having a sparser fair, having fewer collectors, gave you more insight into how much selling was done in advance of the fair, because of course the fair is the theatre, it's this grand moment, and it's meant to be buzzy and all those kind of things, but we do know that lots of sales happen before fairs. Loads of stuff is set up in advance. Has this fair given you any more perspective about just how much of that's happened?
Oh, I'm sure people did a lot of work before the art fair, but I think we've only just got to put ourselves into the shoes of a gallery here. You're spending an awful lot of money to come here. Everyone will have been worried. I think, like, we were all worried. What happens if you get coronavirus while you're here and you end up having to stay in Switzerland at great expense and goodness knows where, because all the hotels are full, for 10 days or whatever the rules are. But just those sort of practical things aside, just imagine any fair. Would you turn up with a stand, having spent all this money, and just kind of hope that people are going to turn up? Of course you wouldn't. I think you would, of course, do an awful lot of preparation. And, of course, preparation means contacting all your collector base, sending them work that you think will interest them, probably talking to them in advance, encouraging them to come, encouraging them to buy. Yes, I'm sure quite a lot of things were sold, really, in quotes, before they got here. But you do always need some reason to make people part with their money. Again, sorry to be so basic, but if you don't need another coat and there's a coat in a shop and it's going to be there for the next 2 years, what's the motivation to go and buy it? And I think a lot of people felt that art fairs provide that kind of moment where you've got a chance to say to the people, make your decision now or somebody else is going to buy it. And again, if you think about the digital space and you think about what, say, galleries like Gagosian did in the lockdown with those 48-hour sales, they were absolutely quite clearly trying to create an event with a fixed moment where somebody has to say, actually, I need to buy this now. Because otherwise, it's human nature. A lot of us would sit and think about it for quite a long time and might even think about it so long that we've gone off the coat or the picture we were,
So what about the makeup of galleries at the fair? Does it look much as it has done in the past?
Overall, I would say that the gallery list does look pretty similar, the core gallery list. The vast majority of galleries who come to Basel will want to come to Basel. I don't think you can see Basel as a bellwether of fairs in general. It's reached a particular level. I think in the modern contemporary world, it is unarguably the leading fair. The Basel Fair is the leading fair. So if you're going to come to any art fair, you're going to come to this one, even in a coronavirus year, because you will at the very least get access to all these very top European collectors. And as I say, I heard rumours that some really big Americans had come in, probably on private jets. So, some very big collectors came, and the galleries are going to want to come and see them. So the core list, I think, does look pretty similar. There was a moment when I turned a corner and saw some works by Michael Rakowitz, and I thought it wasn't the same works, but I really did have a sense of déjà vu. I was like, I'm sure I saw something very similar here 2 years ago. Having said that, like all fairs, Basel has sections that are very specifically designed to encourage new galleries to apply. So one of my very local galleries, Emmeline, which is on the sort of East End, Bethnal Green, Shoreditch area, is here for the first time in the statement section. And then there's features. There's another section where it's often galleries that would normally show, but they show a special presentation, or it's a new gallery with a special presentation. So, of course, like all fairs, Basel does want to bring in some new, fresh faces. However, the biggest sense of déjà vu was on the first floor, which is the more contemporary floor. And I turn around and I see Jeffrey Deitch. And he's got that same space that he always had, the one with the stairs going up. And he's actually put work on all, I say 3 floors. The top one is very tiny, but up this staircase. And I looked at him and I thought, I'm sure Deitch hasn't been here for years, but maybe not as many years as I think. So anyway, I went to speak to him, and he's actually come back for the first time in 12 years to occupy his old space. So that was a kind of, old new presentation.
I mean, does that tell us anything? I mean, is that just a sort of anomalous presence at the fair? He's always been a maverick, and he's being maverick.
I think Deutsch is a maverick being maverick.
Okay.
But I suspect he quite likes the fun of the fair, I have to say. And I think that quite a lot of people here have found themselves enjoying fairs again. I don't think we will see people doing anything like as many fairs if they don't have to. I'm talking about galleries now. I'm not sure whether collectors are going to do as many fairs, but I think the super top level of fairs, Basel being the prime example, sure, they don't want it to be like this every year, but I definitely think they will be happy with how this year went.
Now, we've heard about all COVID protocols which seem a bit stricter than elsewhere in Europe. So, for instance, if you have the AstraZeneca vaccine, that you may not have been able to get into the fair. What was the reality when you got there?
Well, the rules, in fact, changed on the Monday. So if you flew in on Sunday, I think many of the rules were still in place, which is that you were going to have COVID tests every 48 hours. In fact, I arrived on the Monday and found that because of that rule change, it was actually very straightforward. So I was very pleasantly surprised. I was pleasantly surprised at the airport, although I've still got the return journey to make. I was pleasantly surprised at the airport. I was pleasantly surprised here. I think most people have felt, once you've got your wristband, it does make things much easier. It makes things easier around and about Basel. I think the fair genuinely have tried as hard as they can. The rules were coming from the Swiss government around large-scale events, but as I say, those rules have changed. Having said that, as far as I'm aware, there's still a number of vaccines that are less common in Europe that are not recognised, and that's what's caused a lot of the problems. We had the travel advisory from the Americans, but equally a lot of people, I think, in other places have been vaccinated with vaccines that aren't recognised, and I think that's really caused a lot of the difficulties this year.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for telling us about it.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
You can read all the latest Art Basel reporting at theartnewspaper.com or on our app for iOS and Android, which is available from the App Store or Google Play. Coming up, I speak to Mary Beard about her new book, and we look at Christo and Jeanne-Claude's final fabric wrapping of a building in Paris. But first, here are a few of the top stories on our website this week. London's National Gallery has just acquired a painting which once formed part of Hitler's Führer Museum. As Martin Bailey reports, the Swiss artist Alexandra Calam's chalet at Rigi from 1861 may have once been owned by a Jewish victim of the Holocaust before being looted for Hitler's collection. It was recovered by American troops in 1945 and passed into public ownership before, in 1985, the Austrian authorities decided that unclaimed artworks that may have been owned by Jewish people should be sold at auction, with the proceeds going to benefit victims of the Holocaust. It was bought at Christie's in 1996 by Asbjørn Lunde, a New York lawyer with Norwegian parents. He bequeathed it through the American Friends of the National Gallery, where it went on display this week. The long-awaited Guggenheim Abu Dhabi will open in 5 years' time, said the institution's director Richard Armstrong at a press briefing in Basel on Tuesday. The museum, an outpost of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, was first announced in 2006. Designed by Frank Gehry, it would be the Guggenheim's biggest space at around 320,000 square feet. It was initially due to open in 2012 and then in 2017. Firesight in Colchester has won the Art Fund Museum of the Year 2021 award. The £100,000 prize is the largest of its kind and was awarded to the museum in Essex, South East England, for being an outstanding example of innovation and integrity, according to Jenny Waldman, the Art Fund director and chair of the judging panel. The small museum won the award in part for its work during the pandemic, including hosting a food bank, creating free activity packs with renowned artists during lockdown, and running the Great Big Art Exhibition, which encouraged the public to make works of art and stick them in their windows. The other shortlisted museums were the Centre for Contemporary Art Derry Londonderry, Experience Barnsley, the Thackeray Museum of Medicine in Leeds, and Timespan in Helmsdale. You can read all these stories and much more on the website or the app. We'll be back after this. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. On the 30th of September, Christie's will offer objects from a unique collection of 19th century fine and decorative arts in an aesthetic odyssey, the Peter Rose and Albert Gallican collection. Comprising 300 lots of British decorative arts and paintings, the auction's led by The Light of the World, a contemporary studio version of the William Holman Hunt masterpiece that was, in its own time, recognised as one of the most famous paintings in the world. Proceeds from the sale will go to benefit the Albert Dawson Educational Trust. Established in 2003, the Trust promotes and supports the study of 19th century British fine and decorative arts. Find out more on christies.com. Welcome back. Now, Mary Beard, the broadcaster and professor of classics at the University of Cambridge, has a new book out next week. 12 Caesars, Images of Power from the Ancient World to the Modern, studies how images of Roman autocrats, and particularly the 12 Caesars, beginning with Julius Caesar in 48 BCE and ending with Domitian in 96 CE, have influenced the representation of power for more than 2,000 years, from great paintings by Hans Memling and Titian to cartoons in contemporary newspapers. I spoke to Mary about the book. Mary, I wanted to begin by asking you, is this a classics book or an art history book?
I think it's both. It's a classicist, looks at art history and hopes that classics has got something to offer art history. I say that quite modestly because, I'm not, as you know, Ben, I'm not an expert, in Titian or in Renaissance tapestry. But I think sometimes it's worth just crossing the line a bit and seeing if you dig around from your own perspective, you can offer something in due modesty to the other subject.
And it's one of the things, reading it is the scope of the book. When you talk about the modern period, it really is an expansive view of that modern period, looking back at the ancient world,
yes,
isn't it?
Yeah, it's anything from 14th century onwards, really. All of that's modern to me.
There's a nice quote at the start of the book. I'm going to quote it back at you near the start of the book, which says that there are basically it's a book of discovery, misidentification, hope, disappointment, controversy, interpretation, and reinterpretation. And that's super clear, actually. I found reading it. Tell us about that. What do you mean by that?
I think what struck me as I worked more on what I call modern images of Roman emperors was, actually how fluid the whole story of that is. I mean, it starts fluid because no one can quite be sure, in most cases, what ancient statue is a statue of which emperor, or if it's an emperor at all. So there is a kind of messy fluidity at the very beginning. But then, decade by decade, century by century, people have re-identified those ancient statues, they've copied them, they've messed them up, they've misidentified them, they've lost them, they've decided they didn't like Caligula, so they'd have a Trajan instead, they put the wrong labels on the bottom, they haven't read the Latin, and so forth. And, I think one has to be a bit careful here because, we all make mistakes. And so it's, I don't want the book to seem as if it's a kind of classicist coming along, wagging her finger and saying, tut, tut, you didn't see this was Tiberius. Part of the pleasure of these emperors, only part, is that they have got everywhere and they've been re-identified and they've been reconstructed differently, and then somebody decided it wasn't Julius Caesar anyway, etc., etc. So it's good fun. It's there's a bit of a detective story, I think, built in this.
That very much comes across. And that chapter on Julius Caesar is very instructive, isn't it? Because I hadn't realised until I read it that, basically our idea of Julius Caesar is founded on a series of misidentified busts.
Yes. And in some ways, I think this is good fun. I think it's liberating to discover that. But I think that sometimes archaeologists just give such an impression of certainty, and they've got things straight and sorted, that they mislead people, including me, into thinking that somehow we know who's who. And I once asked my students, why was it so difficult to actually identify busts of Julius Caesar? And they got all terribly learned. It took them ages to get to the point that there aren't any which are labelled. There isn't one that has come down with his name on, apart from coin portraits.
But of course, each age reinvents him, and that's another key point, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and so you get people both reinventing him and finding amongst the supposedly bona fide ancient versions, though some of those are probably 18th or 19th century, even when they look bona fide. You find that each age kind of goes after a different one that finds the image. This is the authentic image of Caesar. This is the authentic image of Caesar done from the life during his lifetime, etc., etc. And then that somehow holds the field. It gets replicated. Modern artists look to it and think that's going to be my base, and then some other statue comes along with somebody else speaking out for it, and everything changes. The previous favourite ends up being put in the store, 19th century fake, and there's a new one all ready to hold the stage for 50 years or so.
And yet there's that something which occurred to me when I read it was absolutely spot on, which was that, of course, we all sort of agree what Julius Caesar looked like.
Yeah, and so I think, there's this fluidity, but then the combination of his portraits on coins, the copies and the versions, both ancient and modern, and quite different in some respects, but they kind of converge onto Kenneth Williams in Carry On Cleo. Slightly gaunt face. I mean, he's spot on, and the question is, if you kind of pushed me and said, do you think Julius Caesar really looked anything like that? Well, probably he did a bit. But it's nothing like, I think we're dealing with a phenomenon here that's nothing like our kind of cult of the modern portrait, where, in many ways we're supposed to see the person. We're supposed to, even if it is not lifelike, there is supposed to be a kind of essence or something about the person that's recaptured. I mean, what's recaptured in these, and I think it's just as important, honestly, is their political role. It's what they stand for is recaptured. So it's, it's not a kind of romantic communing with the very being of Caesar. It's Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome.
That's right. You mentioned coins there, and of course there's a very nice a chapter again about coins and not just about the coins themselves, but about the way that they are represented. And you reproduce that wonderful Hans Memling painting, for instance. Tell us about the Memling and what did that tell us about the significance of the coins?
I think what's very interesting about that Memling is that the figure, whoever he is holding up. The thing you notice is that he's holding up to the viewer of the portrait a coin of Nero. And there have been all kinds of puzzles about this. Why is this presumably honorific portrait in some sense? Why is this guy displaying a coin of, one of the ancient world's renowned monsters? And there have been lots of, ingenious, good attempts to explain that, that it's a pun on his name or it was a coin he owned or whatever. We really don't know. But I think that what it sparked me off to see, and I'm certainly not the first person to have seen this, I'm a bit late to the party here, is that before, let's say, 16th, 17th century, the image of the Roman emperor, the image of Romans, really, was fixed not by marble sculpture, it was fixed by little coins. And the cult of the coin in the Renaissance, part of it was quite nicely democratizing because not many people can own marble busts of emperors, but lots of people can own coins of emperors. But there was a kind of way of seeing coins that we've just lost. Okay, some of it might be hyperbole, but these guys getting a portrait of Augustus on his coins, they're saying, I am seeing the real person here. They are enthusing about the coin and about their direct contact. This is not like reading Suetonius, who might have given you all kinds of biased version of what Augustus looks like. Look at this coin and you're looking at something Augustus himself sponsored. And I think that those numismatists who've said, look, to kind of give a slightly spurious technical term, the image of the Roman emperors, or the study of Roman emperors, the 15th century, 14th century, was nomocentric, focused on coins. We can't understand that because we're marmora-centric. And we find it very difficult to thrill to a coin. We find it quite difficult, I think, to thrill to a marble bust. We find it even more difficult to thrill to a coin. But that was where you got your first view and your most authentic view of the emperor. And that is, in the case of something like Caesar, that has been used all the time as the kind of the key to unlock the sculptures. How far does the sculpture look like the coin?
That's fascinating. I mean, and one of the lovely threads through the book is this idea that every age has a defining view of the classical world, which is very much its own interpretation. And so, for instance, the 18th century is littered with references to classical bodies in a way that the Renaissance period responded to different elements of the classical world, right?
Yeah, and in the 19th century, I think what you find is different emphases. I think all these, there's continuity in a way between all these threads through the period, the different periods, but the emphasis shifts very strikingly. So, by the time you get to the 19th century, okay, there've been very nasty pictures of Nero inspecting the body of his dead mother, whom he's killed, for centuries, but it becomes the focus of attention. How can you use this image to think about the paradoxes of monarchy and the corruption of power, and so forth? And so you see the same memes, in a way, let's call them memes, being repeated but re-emphasised and reinterpreted throughout the period.
You talked about Titian earlier on. Titian Caesars are really fascinating, but partly because we have no means of accessing just how widely circulated they were, how important they were perceived to be, how they represented Titian to so many people of the past. Tell us about those. Caesars.
Yeah, well, they represented Roman emperors in a way that now seems incomprehensible to us. That would have been the vision. And the Caesars commissioned by Federico Gonzaga for his Camerino dei Cesari at Mantua at the beginning of the 16th century. And they have a very checkered history. They don't survive. They're part of Charles I's hall of his Mantua pieces coming to London. Then at the fall of Charles I, politely put, they end up going to Madrid, and in the 18th century they're destroyed in the Great Alcazar fire. And they've been a focus of attention and puzzlement and kind of detective story ever after. One of the puzzlements is that there's only 11 of them. Everybody thinks, what do Caesars come in? Well, they come in dozens, don't they? There are 12 Caesars. And Titian Caesars, as we can tell from descriptions and from some copies that we have, didn't include Domitian. And so there's been a lot of puzzlement, and still unanswered puzzlement, about why he only did 11. I think my favourite bad explanation is that Titian was working in a small room and with Giulio Romano, who was in control of the overall design, and they couldn't fit 12 in.
That's right. Two of the great visual minds of their age somehow managed to mismeasure a room.
They think, oh, damn it, what are we going to do now? Or let's I just have to have 11. But it remains that kind of wonderful sense that you have the incomplete series. Ever since the rediscovery and the refashionability of Suetonius, Caesar's came in 12, and Titian kind of offers us this version of a sequence which hasn't quite finished. I think it's partly a nod to dynastic continuity. This is not a bounded series. doesn't quite end. But I mean, I think for hardcore Titian scholars, it's been hugely frustrating in a way, because what was looked upon as, in a sense, one of the central sets of Titian's masterpieces are gone. And what you're left with is copies of all kinds of different genealogy, without the original, whether that's in print, whether everybody comes along and they add the 12th Caesar, of course, because who the hell wants just 11 Caesars? They get copied and replicated all over Europe. As I say, certainly the originals were burnt in the Alcazar fire, but that didn't stop people thinking they hadn't been burnt really. And you get wonderful, Abraham Darby IV thinks that he's got some of Titian's real ones, and other people think they managed to get to America. So you have this sort of Loch Ness Monster style version of what happened to the Titians. But they're also, as I say, they're copied in paint, but they're most famously, I suppose, they're copied in print. And Aegidius Sadler, around the turn of the 16th, 17th century, does a series of prints which also add in a Domitian, but become the face of the Titians. And then from the prints, they get onto teacups, into waxwork, remade back into sculpture, until they sort of, by the end of the 19th century, have gone out of fashion. And they were, I think, very, very different from what we or the 19th century would expect, because they're, as far as we can tell from the copies, they're using coin portraits to create the faces, but they're 3/4 length portraits, and incredibly vivaciously posed, and somehow talking to one another, in their original positions around the room. And, in the end, I suppose they just didn't look like what we want emperors to look like.
I wondered about that, because it seemed to me that there was a certain nobility to each of them, and we don't, in a way, we don't want our 12 Caesars to be noble, each of them, do we? We want them to be fallible and venal and violent and
Yeah, we do. But then, what is very odd is that more artists of different sorts would still give you kind of cutesy images of Caligula, who, if you read Suetonius, was the greatest monster of the whole lot of them. So there's a funny sort of awkward negotiation between image and reputation. And most artists find it easiest to capture the bad reputation of the bad in narrative scenes rather than in portraits, for kind of obvious reasons. How do you show a bad man when all you can showing is above the neck? But that's where some of these narratives of murder, snooping, the court, the nasty inside story of what it's really like in Augustus's court, horrible. Angra was, absolutely preoccupied with that.
Obviously, the Titians made their way to Madrid through Charles I, and Charles I is a sort of pivotal character in this, to a certain degree, because of course there's also the great triumph of Caesar by Mantegna that's still in the UK now. What did Charles I see in them? Was it how deliberate was his collection of Caesarian images?
So far as I can make out, our glorious monarch didn't actually have much to do with the specific choices, so it was his agents who were doing this. He didn't send them with a shopping list saying, bring those Mantegnas. But it is interesting that some of the key pieces that they bring focus on Roman emperors. And I think one of the most interesting, now admired, actually, are the sequence of Mantegna's triumphs of Caesar. And it's often, I think, been treated a bit too uncritically, that painting. People have done amazing work on it and have shown, how these scenes of the triumphal procession, how Mantegna is drawing on all kinds of antiquarian knowledge. They've been the subject of hugely important work. But But I think that it's only kind of recently, and I'm thinking here partly the recent book by Stephen Campbell, that people have looked at the figure of Caesar at the end of this. You've got this, you've got the booty, you've got the loot, you've got, procession being, Rome quintessentially conjured up. And the final scene is Caesar on his chariot. The face is actually slightly repainted, but on the basis of a quite good copy. And very few people really, until in print, maybe lots of people did in other ways, till recently have said, what happens to Caesar next? What's the next bit of the story? Well, it's assassination, isn't it? And so you have this procession, and it's in some ways cutting a few corners. It's the last major processional ceremonial event of Caesar before the assassination, and canny viewers surely knew that. I do like the thought, though this is entirely my fantasy, that when Cromwell had most of Charles's stuff flogged off, he kept the Mantegna's triumphs. That's why they're still in Hampton Court. And I kind of like to think that Oliver Cromwell got the point. He saw that actually this was the prequel to the assassination of the monarch. Now, lots of people will tell me that this is mere fantasy, but it's a nice fantasy, isn't it?
It is indeed. And you mentioned tapestries. Those Henry VIII tapestries are unbelievably important works in their time.
Yes, and Henry VIII commissions a series of tapestries, which are always said to be, none of them now in their original form survive, but their descendants do. And you can, Tom Campbell has done a lot of good work on assembling a genealogy of these so we can see what the series look like. But I think what's important, and I think this did take a classicist to see rather than an art historian. I think it's what I kind of, my brownie badge for tapestry is here coming out. What you have in these tapestries is not what they're always said to be, scenes from the life of Julius Caesar. What these scenes show, without any doubt, they are illustrations of Lucan's epic on the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, written under Nero, but it in part reveals the corruption of autocracy and the ills of civil war. So it's not these tapestries are not a series of the life of Caesar. They're a series of almost explicitly anti-autocratic images. I think you've got to be a bit careful because Lucan has been differently interpreted over the centuries. And by the time you get back to the age of Henry VIII, maybe he's more thought of as somebody who's criticising the evils of civil war, but he's never been thought of as a proponent of autocracy. And so you think, okay, so these were almost, apart from another set of tapestries, the most expensive bits of stuff in Hampton Court. These were phenomenally valuable. And they're a critique in some way of one-man rule in a royal palace, guys. Now, how do you start to explain that? And I think, one explanation is red faces all round when they arrived from the Low Countries. The household unwrapped them and saw what they were, and they thought, "Oh my God, what are we going to tell His Majesty about this?" Whoops. Possible, but I think unlikely. And I think it's much more likely that what you're seeing here, as with many of these images of emperors, is not just the kind of image of power legitimating my rule and my dynasty. There's a bit of that, of course. They're also quite interesting, I think, in setting up what must have been dialogues and debates and discussion about power and royal power and one-man rule amongst onlookers, their owners, and the kings themselves. I think I did come to the conclusion, much as I'm not a monarchist, but working on this book did make me see that it's damn difficult being a king, And in a sense, one of the things that kings are doing in their decoration, and I think you can go back to the Roman Empire for this, is they're talking about the difficulty and the problems of monarchy as much as bolstering their regime. I feel that's in a way where this book has a bit of a message for now, because we have recently, particularly in our recent statue wars, we have come to assume, I think, that the public sculpture or sculpture in general is always celebratory. That the people we have represented around us are people we admire. Well, you can't take that line for the Roman emperors. They knew, people who commissioned these works knew what these guys were like. Only one of them died in their beds without any allegation of foul play. What you are doing is you are choosing a problematic series of images. And, I think that maybe it might be useful for us sometimes if we realise that images were not always about just those people we liked.
That is fascinating. and indeed, that makes me think, and it's a very clear message from the book, is that it seems to be the messages that they can contain that keeps everybody returning to them. It's why those stories are so compelling, that the images of power are endlessly, ultimately fascinating, but also retellable.
Yes, and malleable, and you can do it from a different way round. And, what do we think of Nero? So, you get one of those famous images from the 19th century in Waterhouse's Nero lying on his bed, after having had his mother murdered. And, he looks for all the world like an adolescent, a moody adolescent. We've seen them. And, of course, one of the things about Nero is he was a moody adolescent. There are all kinds of ways of recasting and refocusing our views of these. And artists have done it with immense aplomb for many centuries, and they are still doing it.
Mary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ben.
12 Caesars, Images of Power from the Ancient World to the Modern is published by Princeton University Press. It's published in the UK on the 28th of September and priced £30, and in the US on the 12th of October, priced $35. And finally, it's time for this episode's Work of the Week. Last weekend, Christo and Jeanne-Claude's final wrapped building opened in Paris. L'Arc de Triomphe wrapped was first considered as an idea by Christo and Jeanne-Claude in the early 1960s, when Christo lived and worked close to the monument. And while Jeanne-Claude died in 2009, Christo was able to reinstigate the project in 2017. Originally, it was intended to be unveiled in April 2020, but a combination of the pandemic and the need to protect nesting kestrels in the arch meant that it had to be postponed. Christo then died in May 2020 before he got the chance to see his vision of 6 decades realised. But his nephew, Vladimir Yavachev, who's worked on Christo and Jeanne-Claude's project for more than 30 years, was able to complete the work to his uncle's wishes. I spoke to Vladimir about the work. Vladimir, could you give me a bit of detail about the background to the work? Because I know that Christo first conceived of the idea of wrapping it 60 years ago, but it hadn't been one of those projects where he'd been trying to do it for the last 60 years, right?
That is correct. The initial idea for the wrapped Arc de Triomphe was conceived by Christo and Jeanne-Claude in 1961. Christo arrived in Paris in 1958, and he lived in Paris between 1958 and 1964. And he became Christo in Paris at that time, in the late 50s, because before that he was signing all his paintings, mostly paintings up to that point, with the last name Yavachev. And then he started making the packages and the other contemporary works, which he started signing Christo. And in the late 50s, early 60s, Christo and Jeanne-Claude had a lot of proposals for a wrapped public building, and that being a parliament prison or a monument or a stadium. And the Arc de Triomphe was one of those proposals where they made a photo montage. Actually, the photo montage was done by Schunk and Kender, the photographers that did the famous Yves Klein photo montage of him jumping off the wall.
Yeah.
So they had a lot of ideas at the time about these public buildings, and some of them pursued, some of them developed into being the wrapped Reichstag later on. And the Arc de Triomphe just stayed dormant until 2017, when Christo woke it up again.
Right, and he woke it up through this, basically in connection with the Centre Pompidou, planning for a Centre Pompidou exhibition, and it was proposed to him then that he did something public in Paris, right?
Correct. And the then director of the Pompidou, Bernard Blistein, and the president of the Pompidou, Serge Lesvin, were asking if it's possible to do some sort of intervention. And that's when Christo said, the only thing I would really like to do is do the Arc de Triomphe wrapped. And they took it up the chain of command, so to speak, to Mr. Belaval from the Center of Monument National, and in turn to President Macron. They all actually quite liked the idea and gave us the okay, and that's how it basically developed.
Before we start talking about the actual work, one of the things I was struck in seeing it last weekend was that it's not just a matter of wrapping the Arc de Triomphe, it's a matter of enormous efforts to ensure that the public has the maximum viewing opportunity, haven't you? Because you closed the junction that surrounds the Arc de Triomphe, the Place de Charles de Gaulle, is such a busy junction, and you've managed to get it pedestrianised for the length of this project, which it seems to me is an extraordinary commitment to culture.
That was probably a more difficult permission to get than the actual to wrap the Arc de Triomphe, but it was we convinced them finally because it was a safety issue for the public mostly, because when there's so many people coming, this was a safety issue, and that's how we managed to convince the prefecture to close Place d'Étoile.
Now let's talk about the technical aspects of the work itself, because it's 25,000 square metres of the fabric and then 3 kilometres of rope. So tell us about that, and what kind of fabric is it? Because it's got this shiny metallic power, but it's also got this blue colour.
Well, the fabric is almost identical to the fabric that Christo and Jeanne-Claude used for the wrapped Reichstag. And the wrapped Reichstag was quite larger. It was 4 times the amount of fabric. It was 100,000 square meters of fabric. And it's polypropylene, loosely woven polypropylene, 600 grams per square meter. So it's quite thick. It doesn't look like it from far away, but because of the scale of the building, it looks much silkier than it actually is. And it's recyclable polypropylene, and the 3 kilometers of rope give the shape of the arc as Christo would have liked it. And it's actually the most interesting thing about the fabric, and the difference between the fabric on the Arc de Triomphe from the Reichstag is that under the silver coating, it's blue, and it's covered with basically the silver coating is pulverized aluminum, which all the 25,000 square meters of fabric, the company that does the coating used 1 kilogram of aluminum, which is about as big as your fist. It's not very large amount, and it is not chemical process because it's just pure aluminum that gives that very metallic shine.
Yeah.
And it's the same process that was used for, as I said, for the Reichstag, but it was also the same fabric and process that Christo and Jeanne-Claude wanted to use for Over the River, which was a project that they abandoned. And the only difference with Over the River is that the weight of the fabric was a little bit less. It was not as heavy as the wrapped Reichstag and the Arc de Triomphe fabric.
How much did the earlier wrapping of the Pont Neuf contribute to the kind of goodwill of Paris to allow this to happen? Because that was obviously a landmark project for Christo and Jeanne-Claude.
Oh, a lot. I think this permission process, which went relatively painless and easy, it's due to the support of President Macron, of course. But I think it's the Parisians had such a good memory of the Pont Neuf that was done in 1985 that made it much easier this time around.
Christo was involved right to the end, right? So effectively every aesthetic and practical decision was made with Christo present and viewing. So he saw the tests that you do, the life-size tests that are so crucial, that Christo always said were absolutely crucial to the realisation of the project.
Yes, absolutely. He was involved in selecting the fabric, the ropes, the details of how the corners and the cornices will be done, to really the smallest detail. The only thing we had to change was that at the very bottom of the Arc de Triomphe, originally there is a bench that people sit on, and the Center of Monument National was wanting us to extend that bench just to replicate it so people can sit on it. And then we did some tests, and Christo really didn't want it, but it was something that they asked us to have. And we did some tests, and they looked kind of okay, and he accepted to do it in a certain way to wrap the bench in fabric, but not with the deep folds. And then when we put the fabric down, and I saw that the bench made the arc look like it was sitting on a plate, not even on a plinth, but like on a plate. It just didn't look planted in the ground. I talked to the CMN, and they were quite understanding, and they understood visually that it doesn't fit. So we managed to cut the bench and make the fabric really go to the bottom. And what actually is really beautiful now, if you, I don't know when was the last time you were there, but the more the time passes, because people touch the fabric so much, and all the creases and where people touch it, the blue is coming through much more because of the aluminum that is pulverized and coated on top of the fabric is not very durable, and which is intentional too. And it almost looks like it's become much more sculptural. It looks like a bronze sculpture that somebody touches the nose or the fingers or the hand or the breasts of a bronze sculpture. How, you know, in the parks you see, and then there are places that are much more rubbed off. So it's really become much more sculptural, and I really think Christo would have enjoyed that very much. I love it. It's very nice how the folds have really settled and this blue coming through. It's really beautiful.
How lovely. Obviously, you're speculating what he would have liked. I mean, it must have been strange completing the project without him.
Oh, absolutely. That was the biggest challenge for me, is for him not to be here. It was a personal challenge. It was a challenge to miss his enthusiasm, his excitement, his criticism. And we try to keep the excitement as much as we can with the workers. And it was actually, it still does feel like a Christo and Jeanne-Claude project, even without Christo and Jeanne-Claude, which is a great compliment. And also, I personally think it really does look like the drawings. So then I think we've done a pretty good job.
That's absolutely right. From my point of view, when I saw it, I was struck by just how much it looked like the drawings. And I was wondering, to what extent do you, whilst you're completing the work, how much do you have the drawings like present with you? How much do you refer to them as you're doing it?
Well, when we were doing the final touches, because the fabric came down on Sunday, September 12th, and it came down in one day. We unrolled the fabric in one day, and then we spent the next 4 or 5 days to put the ropes, make the ropes tighter, make the connections, and all these things. And we have very detailed technical plans that are on the ropes and how everything goes. But at the end, you still do look at the drawing just because that is the vision. And then how if it's like, if a rope has to go a little bit up or down, it's always better to refer to the drawing, because that's the artistic vision and not the technical part. So we looked at them constantly. It was something we did.
Now, this is the very last of the wrapped buildings, right? So there were various other projects which were proposed. You mentioned Over the River earlier on. There were various other projects which existed as drawings and other things. But because Christo started this and got so far with it, it was appropriate to complete it, right?
Well, it was his wish. It was his wish for us to complete it. It was something that made me promise him that we'll do it. And also, but this is the last project with the use of fabric. But we also have another project, which is the mastaba for Abu Dhabi, which is a permanent sculpture in the desert, which he also wished for us to finish. So we'll push on for that one. We still don't have permission and all these things, but there's definitely a future, and I think feel very positive about it, and I'm actually sure we will build it. It's just a question whether it takes 3, 5, 10, or 15 years.
Okay.
And patience we have. So it's something that I've learned from Christo and Jeanne-Claude over the years. So this is something that only the future will tell.
And what about reconstructions? The blueprints exist for these extraordinary projects. Would you consider redoing anything that had been done in the past?
Absolutely not. This was something that was very important to Christo and Jeanne-Claude. They firmly believe that these projects are once in a lifetime and never again. And it's something that they, even while they were still alive, it was offered to them constantly and they always refused because it is a once in a lifetime and never again, and it would be just a reproduction of something that was specific to a place, time, and it had this magic about it, and so there's no need to recreate it again, and who was there to see it and experience it. And for the rest of the people that didn't, there are usually films and photographs and records and archives of it. So in a way, that also, that once in a lifetime and never again creates that rush for people to come and see the project for these 16 days that it exists. I mean, you really have no idea how many people have called me in the last 5 days saying, oh, I wasn't planning to come, but now I look at the pictures and I'm changing my plans and we're coming. And it creates that rush. And that is wonderful. And it is part of the work of art. It's part of the life of the work of art. It's part of making this work of art alive. And especially with the use of fabric, which makes it move with the wind, and the building is now alive. It's something that makes it very special, and people really enjoy it. And we want to preserve this, in a way, honesty, this kind of pureness of it, by not reproducing them again. And that was also Christo and Jeanne-Claude's wishes.
Okay, well, Vladimir, thank you so much for talking to me about it.
Perfect, thank you.
L'Arc de Triomphe Wrapped is on view until the 3rd of October, and access to the work is free. You can read more at christojeannclaude.net. To hear an interview with Christo from our archive, look for the episode published on the 6th of April 2018. And to hear a discussion on his legacy, it's the episode on the 5th of June 2020. There's also a great picture story on the book club page of our website, in which you can see behind-the-scenes shots of Vladimir and Christo working on L'Arc de Triomphe Wrapped. And that's all for this episode. You can subscribe to the Art newspaper on our website. Click on the subscribe link at the top left of the page and you'll find a range of subscriptions. Do subscribe to this podcast and A Brush With, and please give us a rating or review if you've enjoyed it. We're on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. The Week in Art is produced by Julia Michalska, Amy Dawson and David Clack, and David is also the editor and sound designer. Thanks also to Henrietta Bentel and Daniela Hathaway, and to this week's guests, Jane, Mary and Vladimir, and thank you for listening. See you next week. Bye for now. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime.